a lot of people in the community are vested in complexity. We want to make these things more complex. And one of the things we said in Crayon is, I don't want to do that. That complexity is for me, the entrepreneur, the guy who's building this thing to do. It should be simple on the surface for anybody to use.
Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. We often talk about data and AI revolutionizing consumer experience. But what will it take for large enterprises like, let's say, your bank, to offer a Netflix-like personalized experience? And what is the potential impact of something like that? That was the focus of this very interesting conversation with Suresh Shankar, who has spent the last decade evangelizing big data, analytics, and AI. Suresh is the founder and CEO of Crayon Data and earlier founded an analytics firm that he exited to IBM. We spoke about selling to the large enterprise, mistakes that founders often do while scaling their business, and how they can mitigate them. This was a fun conversation, plenty of insights in here, and I'm sure you'll like it. So let's dive in. Hey, Suresh, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, Roshan, glad to be here and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. My pleasure. I thought a nice place to begin would be, how we went from idea to product to company with Crayon Data, right? And we've had this conversation plenty of times with different entrepreneurs, and everyone has a certain process, a certain method to the madness of how an idea is sparked and, they turn it into a viable product and then build a company with people around them and processes and so on and so forth, right? So could you take us through your journey with Crayon Data?
Sure. I like the madness part. I don't know if there's a method, but I'll try to explain that. So first, actually, to answer the question on Crayon Data, I'm going to go back to when I started working. And I've been working 36 years, as you can make out from all the gray hair. And I've only done one thing, Roshan, which is that I've helped companies understand consumers, understand them deeply, create products, experiences, services, market them, engage them, and grow them. That's all I've done. Except that over 36 years, my career has been a steady backward progression, right? I started with sales, went to product management, then I went into advertising, which is one step removed. Within advertising, I went into media, then I went into a regional role. And then I started working. And, after years of doing this kind of stuff, I realized that this whole business of understanding consumers, which when I started was a very right brain creative activity, had become more of a left brain data technology led activity. And that led me to rather stupidly give up my nice, happy corporate job where I was doing very well and become an entrepreneur way back in 2000 in Singapore when I set up an analytics firm called RedPill. RedPill was pioneering in analytics. That time in 2000, analytics wasn't even a thing, right?
Yeah.
It was, no one knew about it. And we pretty much evangelized the idea of analytics in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. So the good thing is that, when you go and do something like that, you have the pain, but you also reap the benefits. So after 4 or 5 years, when it started taking off, we were well positioned. We became the number one analytics firm, and that story ended well when IBM, which was then the top tech firm in the world, acquired RedPill. So that was a good point in life, right? And then I spent 2 years at IBM. I was a global analytics director there. But here's what happened, Roshan. I was sitting there and I was just thinking, and you know how entrepreneurs are fundamentally stupid, and you talked about the madness, right? So I said, hey, what's the next best thing? I already did this move from right brain to left brain, but I can see something beyond analytics. And it was very clear then to me that what was happening is that the amount of data in the world was shooting up. And you can't throw more and more people at the problem because data growth is like this, people growth is like this, talented people growth is even flatter. So you knew the future was going to be about algorithms, about AI, about big data, and about platforms. So that is what led me to quit IBM and say, let me go and build now a platform.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than having people, I'll build a platform where you can help companies understand their consumers, literally as individuals, know their preferences, and be able to engage them at a very individual level. Literally what you call personalization, but I think I wanted to do a very deep form of personalization. So that is really the origin story, if you will, of Crayon Data. And as the
Fantastic.
name suggests, I said, can I make it as simple as using a crayon is, right? I mean, a crayon has no instruction manuals, the child can use it. So that really was the origin story of Crayon.
I love that.
And from there, it's been a long story, but I'm sure we'll cover it as we go along.
Right. I'd love to talk about more about the data, the consumer insights aspects of things and so on. But a slight detour, right? So I have heard you speak about your journey in Singapore, starting from scratch, right? I want you to take us back to that time. What was it like to start from scratch? Because a lot of people are intimidated to give up everything that they have, start afresh, right? And I have heard the story of the Chinese bamboo tree. I'd love for you to I'd love for you to repeat that on our podcast.
Okay, that's the story that's most famously associated with me because I talk about it all the time. So
Yeah.
first of all, when I kind of set up RedPill Analytics, it was a very accidental. I'm an accidental entrepreneur.
Hmm.
I did not quit my corporate job to actually set up a company. I actually quit it to join another startup as the CEO for Asia. And this, if you remember, 2000 is the height of the dot-com boom. And what happened, Roshan, was that I was back home in Chennai, sitting there with my mom. I said, okay, I've just quit my job. I'm going to go back. And then on the 10th day of my 15-day holiday, I got a call from my guy. This guy saying, we're not even starting. So
Okay.
this wasn't a startup that started and failed. It didn't even start. So I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? And I don't know whether you're comfortable with language. I'm like, I was thinking more graphically in terms of language at that time. But that led me to think, and and I said there is some reason why it was happening. And there's this funny story, and all entrepreneurs are full of stories, and not all of them are all BS. I was reading this book called The Alchemist, right? And I just said sometimes you have to follow your dream. Maybe this has happened for a reason.
Right.
So in a funny way, it was a circumstance that forced me to be an entrepreneur, and kind of gave me, I won't say the courage, but said, I was left with no choice but to think, what do I do? And I could have gone back to a job, but I said, maybe there's something out here.
Hmm.
And then I started to think about customer centricity and this whole thing of right brain to left brain. And that's how my first journey started. The second one is a little bit more, I mean, so there are two things that every entrepreneur suffers from. One is hubris. You think you've done it once, you can do it again, and you forget. I'm sure all entrepreneurs will relate to this, but there is this thing about what you call peak end syndrome, that mathematically it's a function that says that you only remember the height of the curve, not the actual the mean of the journey, right? So, and peak end syndrome is when mountaineers reach the summit, they only remember the high, they don't remember how hard it was. So I'd forgotten by then how hard it was to set up and run RedPill. So for me it was okay, when you've done it, you can go and do it again. And so the stupidity gene, as I call it, kicked in again. But what I do remember about Red Pill, and I keep saying the story, Roshan, you asked about the Chinese bamboo tree. I keep saying the story to people is that for me, this has been an inspirational story because, the Chinese bamboo tree is it's a particularly hardy plant. By the way, it's also the most green plant in the world. It's the best thing that you can do. Separate, that's a separate discussion. But you plant it, you water it, you fertilize it, and it's a very slow growing plant, and you do it for a year and nothing happens. It's a particularly slow growing plant. So, you turn up in the second year and you water it, you fertilize it, you tend to it for another year, nothing. Now you say, okay, it's going to take persistence because the thing, and you turn up for the third year and you water it and you fertilize it, nothing. Now, at this point of time, as an entrepreneur, you're blaming circumstances, your friends, your clients, your everything that you're doing around it. You're blaming your family, your wife, your kids, your dog, everything. But you say, okay, I'm going to do it one last year, and you turn up in the fourth year and you water and fertilize the Chinese bamboo tree for another year. Zippo. Now, this is the point that I think separates a true entrepreneur from the person who's just dabbling, because most people give up and they say a hero is a coward who basically just I mean, a coward is a hero who just gave up 1 second before he needed to, right?
Right.
And in the same way, you turn up in the fifth year and you basically say, because the stupidity gene I talk about, that you water and fertilize this Chinese bamboo tree. And guess what happens? In the fifth year, the Chinese bamboo tree sprouts and grows 90 feet in 6 weeks.
Wow.
And this is my favorite story of entrepreneurship, because all entrepreneurship is that story. Except you don't even know whether it's the fifth year. You don't know whether it's 90 feet or 6 weeks, or it's a sixth or a seventh or eighth year. But you've got to have that gene of persistence to come back and keep trying if you really believe in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a common theme that I've seen with the entrepreneurs we've had on the podcast as well. It's not the first idea or the first year that they've really made it. It's a point of convergence, right? And that point of convergence comes from iterating over many months and many years to get to a point where it's now obvious that their success is bound to happen, right? And I'm also reminded of something that Steve Jobs said, which is that if you don't have the passion for it, most rational people will quit, right? Because that's the rational thing to do. So
And there's another wonderful thing that Elon Musk said recently, right? He talked about, someone asked him about, what advice would you give, for empathy to an entrepreneur. He says, if you need empathy, don't become an entrepreneur. So I mean, you got to be a bit mad, you got to be a bit irrational, and you
yeah.
shouldn't need too much empathy from people.
Yeah, for sure. So that's a wonderful start to the podcast, Suresh. I want to shift our gaze to something that you mentioned earlier, which is consumer insights, data, decision making, and so on, right? Now, all of these sound obvious when you put it the way that you did, right? But obviously, I mean, it's not so straightforward. It's fairly complex, right? Could you give us the 101 of this entire thing, right? I mean, could you talk to us about affinity models, all of these things we hear about, next best offers and propensity to buy and whatnot? I mean, it all seems like a complete maze to anyone who's trying to understand, right? So would love it if you could give us a lay of the land, basically.
Yeah. But before I do that, Roshan, just to share your story, right? I'm a guy who failed maths, didn't study statistics, ran away from technology in college. And now God is taking revenge for all those classes I didn't attend by making me do this for a living every day, right? So I'm not an expert. I'm a business guy, as I told you, right? And I know how to use it. And I do also believe that a lot of people in the community are vested in complexity. We
Mm,
want to make these things more complex. And yeah, and one of the things we said in Crayon is, I don't want to do that. That complexity is for me, the entrepreneur, the guy who's building this thing, to do. It should be simple on the surface for anybody to use, right? And that's really
right.
what one of the things that we set out to do in Crayon is simplify the world's choices.
Mm,
So I'll give you you asked for a one-on-one, and I'll try and tell you through a story of the journey itself, right? We are starting off with this, and the one problem that we decided to solve is the problem of choice. Now, most people have heard about the paradox of choice, right? That in life we have too many choices. When you have so much choice, so much information about each choice, the information is conflicting. What ends up is that we spend a lot of time trying to navigate that choice.
mm,
And though choice should be magical, choosing is misery. Meaning, just think about it, right? You want to go out to dinner and then you go and look at some review site and it tells you this restaurant is great, that trend one is terrible. One tells you the food here sucks, the service is great. The other one says the service is great, the food sucks. After 45 minutes of reading six to eight searches, 10 to 12 reviews, what do? You choose the default option. Let's go to the one that I always go to because you know what, that's easy. It's too complicated. And that paradox of choice is what we said. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people get confused by choice and actually are phased by it. But if you show them four to six relevant, that's what the human mind can handle. The human mind can handle about four to six things at one time, right? So four to six choices, people are happier to make choices. People are more confident in the choice. The question we asked ourselves is, while AI and all this stuff is a big thing, how can I apply the problem of big data and AI to solving this one problem of saying, for any individual who wants to make a choice, how do I bring this down to four to six relevant choices? I can't just say I'll give you four to six random choices. I mean, look at your bank today. They're probably spamming you with all kinds of irrelevant stuff, right?
mm, mm.
Another favorite story, 21 years, four credit cards. My bank in Singapore still sends me offers to eat at steak restaurants. I'm like, after probably 2,000 transactions, you should have figured out I'm vegetarian by now, right? So the problem is that we said, how do I solve that problem? Because for me, killing irrelevance, simplifying choice is a massive global problem. The amount of time that people are spending chasing this stuff is quite big, right? So that is a very big problem that we set out to solve. And what we did, Roshan, was very simple, right? We went back not to science of data, but we went back to the science of consumer behavior. And we crafted what we call a very simple equation that every choice that you and I make is a function of your personal taste. For example, I like blue. You'll almost always see me wearing blue shirts. It's a function of, I mean, I'm vegetarian, right? Or I like Japanese food. These are my personal taste. It's a function of the influences on you. So I might listen to my friend Rita when it comes to movies, but I might not trust her judgment in food,
Mm,
etc. Right? The influence on me could be from a newspaper or social media. My current context, because obviously on a Monday morning I'm looking for something quick. If it's a Wednesday evening, it may be more relaxed. If it's Friday, it's something with the family. Thursday evening, it may be a night out with the lads, things like that. And your past behavior. Because if you had, let's say, for you like Japanese food, but you had it 4 days in a row, you might on the fifth day want variety.
mm,
Now, the problem is the cognitive load of making this choice, if you look at it, is on the individual. I have to know what's near me, what's my time of the day of the week. I have to know my tastes. I have to go and look for reviews and things that influence me and like able to shape that. and I know my past behavior. And how do you put all that together into one thing and relieve the individual of making the cognitive load, of the cognitive load, and making a choice easy for him or her? And that means taking in a lot of data. So now, how do we convert consumer behavior into data science, right? So first, when you look at taste data, it's like lying in the internet and review sites and unstructured data sets. What do I mean by that? It's like if I say I like blue, if I say I like vegetarian food, if I say I like bars that are lively, or I like Japanese food, that's all in unstructured data. It's not like an easy thing to. If you want to look for influences, I have to look at like social media. I have to look at again review sites and things like that. Context is possible. It's on your browser and your device. What's near me? What's the time of the day? Your behavior is typically with, as a data set, it's with large traditional enterprises like banks, airlines, and retail, because what the internet knows about you is what you do on this device. The internet does not know what you do in the real world. That is something that your real world company like your bank and all that knows. So we now got a problem that you got 4 or 5 different types of data, unstructured, structured, all owned by different types of companies, and we need to bring it together into one, what you'd call one massive wok, and we need to find a way to mix it so that the recipe that comes out is good, right? So that's really what, the whole thing that we try to do. And what we did, Roshan, is that we created, we didn't create, I mean, we kind of obviously brainstormed a lot as to how to make this happen. And we built out 2 patents. We actually devised 2 patents, and those 2 patents are, encapsulated in something that we call the taste graph. So the Crayon taste graph is basically, it's a map of global taste where we got billions of data points on millions of merchants. What it means is I know, for example, every one of the 4.7 million restaurants in the world. I know hundreds of attributes on each of those restaurants and what they're good at and not good at. And that allows me to kind of say, I know everything about a category, dining, shopping, whatever. The next thing we did is say, okay, I know this, but how do I know that because you like something and you like something else, I can do that? And there are simple algorithmic models like collaborative filtering that say 100 people who did A did B. Therefore, if there's a 101st person, I'm going to recommend B. That's easy. What happens if there's no commonality between A and B? Or I'll give you a more likely one. There are enough commonalities between A and B, B and C, and C and D, but there's no commonality between A and D. And what we did is a particularly, I think a genius thing, where we used an electrical engineering algorithm, and I kid you not, an electrical engineering algorithm to actually calculate what you call a transitive affinity between any 2 points on this graph. I mean, you all heard of the 7 degrees of separation, right?
Right.
So we said, how do I look at a restaurant in Singapore or a shop in Singapore, and if I land up in Sao Paulo, where nobody has been into these 2 cities, how do I make a connection? So that's the kind of affinity mapping that we had to do. And that gives our algorithms and the way we do this whole affinity mapping an extreme sense of power, because I can take 2 completely unconnected, sparsely populated data sets, and I can now make connections where they didn't exist. Obviously, some of the connections in data science language is weak because when sometimes the signal, you can't stretch a signal too much, right? But many cases, what you're trying to find is a significant enough signal that you can act on, and that's really what the core of what we call calculating a net affinity score between 2 entities is. The other interesting thing, Roshan, in this whole model is that we were long before GDPR and the issues of privacy way back in 2013. I had a very clear view in my company: we will not track identity, we will not track people, right? And I'm really glad because right now that's coming to kind of play, right? No one's allowed to track identity anymore with GDPR, with Apple's iOS update. But so we don't want to know Roshan, we don't want to know Suresh. We're saying a person's behavior itself is enough for me to predict what the future behavior to be to personalize. And that's very, again, based on a consumer insight, not based on the fact that, hey, there's data and I can do what I want. And the consumer insight is your behavior is a revealed preference. If every shirt I buy is blue, my behavior reveals my preference. So by observing behavior, I understand, infer your preference, and I use that to make other recommendations to you. So again, I could go on, but I think that's really the way the whole affinity model that we've done in Crayon is built out. And I think a lot of people are coming around to building models that are very similar today.
Right. Yeah, it's a fantastic explanation of fairly complex things, right? And it does seem like it has a lot of math and statistics, right? And when you're working with data science teams, oftentimes one may fall into the trap of like falling in love with the science of it itself, right? And I wonder if you could, how do you talk the same language with these folks? How do you tie it down to a business use case with these folks and act as a sort of a north star? I mean, paint them a sort of a north star metric to go after, and basically augment the team to walk the virtuous path in some sense.
That's a great question. And you ask two questions, the North Star and how do you work with people in a different language, right? So I'll come to the North Star a bit later, but I'll talk about, I think, talking to different teams first. I think the first thing is that, basically people who are from a scientific background, data engineers, data science, software, they want to solve complex problems and they want to solve the technology. For them, the technology comes first.
Mm,
The data science, the model comes first. The business case, the use case comes, I won't say last, but it definitely is not as interesting for them.
mm,
And if you have a guy who's fundamentally focused on the business, the problem is that for them, the use case and the business comes first, and selling
correct.
something comes first, and the technology doesn't really matter.
Mm,
Now, when you look at, I think, most technologies, and this is very true in AI, but it's true of, I think, most technologies, generally technology tends to run ahead of the business curve, right? Because, guys create things because they can, and they build these beautiful things, right?
tinkerers.
And then what happens is that most startups go through this process of what I call dumbing down the tech. If you actually look at our first graph and you look at what we do now, we have dumbed down our tech to make it applicable to business. It doesn't use all that code thing as much as it could have, right? Let me give you a simple example that everybody relates to, right? If you're in the startup world, everybody knows that 10 years ago, Netflix said, we have got the best recommender system in the world. And they actually put it out on Kaggle and said to everybody, if you can beat my recommendations, we'll give you $1 million prize. At that point of time, Netflix was looking at, because they were trying to say any movie on the planet, you can kind of watch and all that stuff, or you can ship it to you. They were looking for recommendations, and they built out a great recommender system. Today, if you look at it, Netflix is not. I mean, the recommendation is what? It's just another endless scroll, just like you have on Facebook or anything else. So they're now focused on content, and they're saying, listen, what people want is range. I'm sure they'll eventually come back and say, listen, the recommendation, the recommender on Netflix, I mean, really, I mean, it's not anymore
Mm,
as wonderful as it used to be. Because what they've now learned to say is that it's not that recommendation alone, it's the fact that people want lots of content. And I'm sure that you'll come back to a stage when Netflix will say, now that I have all the world's content,
mm,
I know again I've got to simplify the choice. But this is a classic case where I think the tech gets ahead of the business, and the business says, I'm going to drive this. And then eventually you come to a point where the tech and the business kind of start to run parallel to each other, if you will. And in general, also because you're a tech person, Roshan, the promises of tech run ahead of reality in the short term. You take Watson, right? IBM Watson played Jeopardy, won Jeopardy. Very, very hard game to play, even as a human being. You take DeepMind, played AlphaGo, won.
mm,
But what happens with all of that is that that promise is a very narrow point solution. It's almost like an AI agent built for one purpose, doing that very well. In the real world, there is no such thing. In the real world, you have a complex problem, which is a bit more, you come in touch with the realities of the world, and such narrow AI agents fail. So, what then tends to happen is that you need to kind of move to a more generalized model, and then you figure out that what you built for the narrow agent doesn't work in the generalized model. I mean, Watson is a classic example. The NLP was in a very specific context of playing Jeopardy, and they said it's going to solve cancer. Very hard problem, very complex problem. Some of the core components of Watson can be used, but this is not as easy a problem to solve, right?
mm,
But here's the other funny thing that I think is important, I think, for people to remember, professionals listening. In the long term, technology outpaces the reality is like much better than the promise. So you take Deep Blue and Kasparov, and the first thing everyone said, oh, no, it could do it, but it was a massive machine. Today, a laptop computer plays better chess than every most grandmasters do.
mm,
So what happens is that I think we also have to be, so if you take this curve, tech promises a lot ahead of reality in the short term, very much ahead of business. Business tends to catch up, dumb down the tech. But at some point of time, the two start to work in parallel. And then the tech gets to a stage where it is so damn good that it really takes over the world. So it's a kind of, I mean, I don't know, it's my own general theory of how tech and business work together. And I don't know whether it's answers your question, but
yeah. No, it
that's what
does.
I've seen happen.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think a lot of the times it's about being approximately right than accurately wrong, right? Uh,
I love that.
yeah. And you bring up Netflix, right? And I'd love to talk about that. I mean, Netflix with movies has done a phenomenal job, right? Or even YouTube, for example, their algorithm is amazing. And arguably, I mean, they're selling you one product and one product alone, right? Content, basically. Now, if you look at some large enterprises like banks, for example, right? Banks have something like 40, 50 products, but the number of products a person might have from a certain bank would be maybe two or three max, right? Not more than that, I suppose, right? And if you look at all of the data points that they pick up as well, right? 10, 20 years of transactions indicating all kinds of behavior, right? So how can large enterprises like banks, for example, or airlines, or even some of the larger restaurants or whatever, right? How do they get to a point where they can offer a Netflix like experience to their consumers?
So well, that's the core of what we try to do in Crayon, and I don't want to make this look like a pitch for Crayon, but basically the fact is that today the reason everyone talks about digital giants overtaking the world, the reason digital giants are taking over the world is that they're very good at saying that I treat every consumer as an individual.
Hmm.
And what do they mean by that? They do three things very well. They profile every individual really well. They engage them with relevance, meaning it's very personalized relevance, and they make the transaction as simple as possible from a wide range of products, right? It's very simple. I profile, I engage, I drive transaction. Now, I'll take Spotify because it's a nicer example in some
Yeah.
ways, right? 200 million customers, 150 million songs. Theoretically, that's 30 quadrillion possible choices. Now, your Spotify feed and my Spotify feed are very different. My Spotify feed on a Wednesday evening is very different from my Spotify feed speed on a Monday morning. Now, how do they bring it down to the 4 to 6 choices and playlists and all of that? That somehow seems to know me and you.
Yeah.
It's a, they do these three things very well. They profile me very well. They engage me with relevance. They're always learning about things, and they make it very simple for me to go and buy that, right? And fundamentally, I think if you're a bank or an airline, that's what you want to do. You got a million customers. Can I really create a deep profile of what we call in Crayon a taste print
Hmm.
for every one of those million customers? Now, for that, that means that it's not just using the bank's data, it's using all kinds of data outside. So I'll give you another personal example, Roshan, which I love to talk about. Every Sunday morning in Singapore, around 8:30, 9 a.m., I have a coffee shop transaction in some part of Singapore. Not necessarily the same brand of coffee shop, not necessarily the same location. Now, for a bank, typically this only means that Suresh, on Sunday morning, 8:30 to 9, coffee shop transaction. They may not even know it's a coffee shop because sometimes they can't even decipher the data about what happens on your. When you look at a credit card statement, sometimes you'll see gibberish. You'll say, "What is this place?" Never
Hmm.
went there. For Maya.ai, which is our platform, it means Suresh is dog friendly and loves outdoor seating.
Hmm.
Now, how does that magic happen? It's because we look at every one of the entities that I go to the coffee shops. We look at all the unstructured data, and we kind of say, hey, listen, okay, all of these coffee shops have some attribute, great cappuccino, no, great soy latte, whatever it is, great ambience, something, something, something. And we figure out and tease out that of all the coffee shops I go to, one of the commonalities that they have outdoor seating and they're dog friendly. Now what that happens is now you say, okay, those two attributes can then be added back to Suresh because actually that's what he's kind of choosing in the morning.
Hmm.
And then you can make recommendations based on that. Now, if you really look at it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reverse engineer consumer behavior. It's Sunday morning. I'm out for a walk with my dog. I am want to pick up a cup of coffee. I need to go to a place that's dog friendly, and my dog can sit outside while I go and pick up the coffee and have it. Now, that's exactly what Spotify does. When you listen to a song, it kind of deconstructs all your tastes, attaches it, and makes it profile,
Hmm.
and then starts providing you the playlist. Now, can a bank do this? I think theoretically they could, but they don't. It's not a technology problem. There is a data problem because the data they have inside is very specific to what happens inside the bank. They don't know what happens outside. So they need to marry internal data with external data. But it's also a mindset problem. That is, do I want to create that personalized storefront?
Hmm.
Why? I have some thousand things. Like I told you, my bank, I'll keep sending him the steak restaurant offers.
Right.
Why do I need to do anything more, right? So I think they have been responsible for losing ground to the digital giants, to the Swiggies and the Deliveroos and the Food Pandas and the Amazons and all of that. But what's also happening with this transfer of data, Roshan, is that it's been a transfer of power. So let me give you an example again. Let's say you have a bank card in India and you go on an order and you go to a restaurant and you use that bank's card. I'm not going to use the name because we have some banking clients in India, right? And then you do that, and now the bank knows where you ate. Now you order the same thing on, let's say, on Zomato. The bank only knows that you ordered something through Zomato. Now that's a huge loss of data, which means now the bank only knows you're going to Zomato. Zomato, on the other hand, knows that you ordered from a restaurant. In fact, it even knows the dish you ordered.
Mm.
So if you lose control of customer ownership,
Mm.
so you lose control of data, you lose control of the customer. You lose control of the customer, you lose control of value. And
Mm.
that's the big thing that is happening. And I think I don't think the story is yet done. I mean, I think everyone, banks are trying to fight back. They're trying to get better at this stuff. So are airlines and hotels and people like that. We'll see. When we're trying to help them in that, we'll see where it goes.
No, I think it's imminent, right? I mean, it's bound to happen once that regulatory moat that banks have becomes sort of irrelevant, right? When once we have like some kind of proactive policy making on that front, and all kinds of these neo banks and whatever else emerge that are data first, data friendly. I think these folks will have to, the elephants will have to dance, right? Basically, because up until now, I think they've just been throwing darts in the dark, and they're happy if one or two sticks, right? I mean, it's perfectly fine. But also, I mean, everything that you're saying, right? I mean, it sounds like something that's amazing and something that's but obvious, right? I mean, if I'm a senior leader at a bank, I mean, this all of this sounds too good to be true, right? I mean, it's something that I should adopt yesterday, right? But and I mean, you have n number of all of these consulting surveys and analyst surveys coming out that they want to invest billions, if not trillions, in AI and whatnot, right? But I mean, you look at the reality and you understand that AI is still a hammer in search of a nail in most of the banks. At least it's not so easy for them to adopt data science, adopt AI, and then tie it to business outcomes as well. So in your experience of having worked with large enterprises and having seen a few of them do this journey, right, where they've made their products more intelligent, where they've become a lot more empathetic to their customers, a lot more relevant, personalized, and so on, what are some things that you have noticed that they do really well that the others can sort of pick up?
I think it's very interesting that you point out the fact that a lot of it should be obvious and people don't do it. Here's my own experience in this whole talking to large enterprises, banks, airlines, and this is the only people we work with.
Mm,
The more senior you go, the more they get it,
mm,
the more they want the change.
mm,
The more you will hear the CEO saying, "I want to be the Netflix of banking. I want to be the Spotify of this, etc." Right? The more they'll say personalization is the answer, marketplaces and digital transformation is the future. Because at that level, they can see the ground shaking. I mean, they can see the
correct.
earthquake, they can see the tsunami that's coming. Now, if you go really young inside the bank or the large enterprise, the guys who are coming are all data savvy. They've been trained to think about data. They've been trained to think mostly even code. And I had in my podcast, I had one of the CMOs of one of the banks in India, and he said, I always listen to some of the young guys because they're the guys who come armed with data to a meeting, right? So the young guys get it. There's a set of people in the middle, and I'm one of the people in the middle from an age profile perspective, but there's a set of people, they've not been incentivized sufficiently from the top to kind of say, hey, I'll change something and whatever it is.
Mm,
They don't understand the new language in the new world enough, and they're getting squeezed. Now,
mm,
at some point, one reason why you see a lot of digital companies over-index on young people is because they want to avoid this problem, right? You get a visionary guy and he says, "I'm going to get a lot of young people and they'll go and solve this problem for us," right? But you have to understand also that it's not. I don't want to piss on middle management or whatever it is, right? But I
mm,
think it's also remember that they are not incentivized sometimes to chase the opportunity. If
mm,
you're a large bank, you have to manage risk. You have to
mm,
manage complexity. The risk of a fine taking away money is much larger than the risk of the opportunity of selling something, right? I mean, look at the amount of fines that banks have paid. I mean, Wells Fargo and cross sell. I mean, everybody. I mean, everybody, every. So they are also trained to manage risk, and that's one of the reasons why the transmission mechanism between the top management, which is seeing the world outside change, the junior people who have the skill sets to make this change happen, and the transmission in between begins to fail them. And it will change over time. I mean, so I also have a view, right? I mean, I know you mentioned neo banks and stuff like that. Banks also are very good at one thing. They're very good at waiting it out. So let's say you have a neo bank. I mean, let's say let me take an example from the UK. Let's say Revolut or Monzo is really big. At some point of time, JP Morgan Chase or somebody is going to say, I'm going to buy you,
Precisely, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the point also is that, and you've seen what happened in China when Ant Financial had to pull the IPO. I mean, also there's political issues out there. But one of the things that's happening is that all the tech firms that have built these great businesses are getting away with it because they don't have the same level of regulation, the same level of compliance, the same level of risk management that a bank is subject to. And there's a CEO of a bank out here who said this, right? He says, I'm subject to regulation, they're not. And he says, if it walks like a bank and talks like a bank, why isn't it regulated like a bank? Right? And it
Yeah.
is going to happen. Now you're going to see more and more people regulating the fintechs and the neobanks the way they regulate, a regular bank. So it's an interesting time, right? It's an interesting time in technology and banking and the banking industry.
For sure, yeah, because I think fintechs are still the front end layer at this point of time, right? I mean, they don't have to deal with all of the stuff from a compliance angle that the banks end up dealing with, and I mean, with some of the banks, I mean, everyone, in fact, I mean, cross sell is almost a bad word, right? It's a four-letter word for a lot of people. And you're right about middle management as well, right? I mean, when you do interact, it's like the Charlie Munger quote, right? I mean, show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome, basically, right?
Yes. I mean,
So
and the guy is paid to minimize risk, right? He's paid to say, hey,
precisely,
things can't go wrong out here. So
yeah,
that's what he's paid to do.
yeah.
And but even the fintechs, I think what's going to happen is that right now the market is awash with capital.
Hmm.
And someone can go and raise $40 million and say, I'm going to do a fintech and I'm going to go on and disrupt this stuff. And I'm going to
Hmm.
burn money to get customers. But the laws of economics will catch up, right? And at that point of time, so you mentioned Munger, you're going to have the other quote from Munger and Buffett, right? When the tide runs out,
Yeah.
it'll show who's naked and who's not, because there will be that moment when you can't keep buying your way
Right.
to kind of customer basis and so on, right? You have to say, my unit economics works. I am able to. I mean, no one will just kind of keep on having a situation where you're paying $100 to acquire a customer who only gives you a million, or who gives you only $1 or $2 of revenue a year.
Absolutely right. I mean, I think we're still very early in the curve, and it's left to be seen as to how this will pan out. And not to belabor the point or anything, but in your experience, I mean, do you think some sort of a partnerships with all of these fintechs or merchants or something is the way forward for now?
So I think so. And I think what's going to happen is that, see, you're clearly already having the oligopolistic ecosystems, right? I mean, like when Facebook and Geo get together, when, those kind of ecosystems are happening the existing oligopolies will do everything they can to protect themselves. In the same way, I think what you're going to start seeing is a bunch of traditional giants and internet giants starting to come together because they both have something for each other. We've enabled a couple of partnerships, for example, between one of the largest lifestyle card issuers and the largest travel marketplaces in the world.
Hmm.
Because this guy sells travel, somebody's got something to sell, somebody's got something to buy, and you need a way to put this together in a way. So I think those kind of ecosystem plays will start to come into existence. What's more interesting, Roshan, is for me the fact that there's a bunch of people who are, I think, revolutionizing and democratizing commerce. The Shopify's of the world were doing that kind of work, right? And I think they present an interesting thing because now the Shopify model is very directly not like the Amazon model. Amazon is I go on to my this marketplace.
Hmm.
Shopify enables like 2 million merchants to be their own marketplace. Now those merchants are demanding, they need demand. Banks have demand in the form of customers. So how do you build marketplaces where you say, hey, you come and get onto my platform as a bank because I can enable you to reach 10 million customers that I have. But by the way, it's still your marketplace, it's still your shopfront. I'm not doing
Hmm.
that. Whereas if you go to Amazon, you get the customer, but you also know that as a merchant on Amazon, that you put something out there, and tomorrow there's going to be an Amazon basic product. They observe what is going on and they'll put out an Amazon basic product. It's like what in the past retailers used to put white label brands of what they were selling.
Hmm.
Amazon Basics will do all of that. So I think there's going to be this backlash of a democratization of the people who are not the giants coming together in some form of partnership, if you will.
Interesting. So let's talk about the people aspect itself, right? And with the preponderance of data and algorithm, data science, whatever, right? I mean, there is also this kind of a fear among people that their jobs will be automated, they will be made redundant, they will become irrelevant tomorrow, and so on, right? That is one aspect of things. The other aspect is to think that okay, you are going to become superhuman with all of these data and capabilities, right? All of the rote work that you once had to do will not be necessary anymore, right? And you will be freed up to think in a creative way, and you'll be able to focus on higher order thinking, right? Now, both of these are extreme situations, right? Extreme camps. I wonder, which side of the middle you belong to.
Okay, that's a hard one. I don't know where I sit. I mean, you're a podcaster, so I run a podcast called Slaves to the Algo.
Hmm.
And the question that I leave answered it, or masters of the algo, right? Is it utopia or dystopia? And the answer to that is neither, right? I mean, it's like, AI or data is a tool, and it really depends on how it gets used. Today, if you look at it, I would say there are very utopian uses of data. Again, in my Steps the Algo, I've talked about people who say how this lady who runs the data lab in Scotland, she talks about how they can actually predict when at the point of checkout of a hospital whether a patient is likely to fall sick again and therefore whether they should keep them for a little bit longer.
Hmm.
So there are utopian uses of data and AI where you're able to get that. And there's obviously completely dystopian things like the algos that I have to name them, YouTube and Facebook used to kind of
Hmm.
keep people coming back for more and more content and stuff like that, right? So where am I in this? Let me just be. I don't want to be neutral because I take sides. I think on the net AI is a net good, but I do think that without regulation and without some level of governmental, I mean, I don't say regulatory oversight, it can become a net bad, right? And I think so. Let me try and explain what I mean by this, right? If you're an individual, here's the only choice that I would suggest that you make. You have to embrace some things that are in the air because there are some things that absolutely add utility to your life,
Hmm.
right? When you look at a health thing that tells you how many steps you took, how your health is, weight is trending, what you're doing, all of that stuff. Or you look at maps. I don't need to worry about a road anymore, right? I can just get on, switch on the maps and go. I think at one level, a lot of AI that's gone into taking and mapping huge sets of data and trying to give you those nudges that make some sense for you are not just net good. They have taken out drudgery from our lives. They've
Hmm.
allowed me, as you said, to focus on things that matter to me. I mean, I don't need to worry about certain things, right? Otherwise, I'd have to go and say, I need to know every route and I need to.
Hmm.
On the other hand, there are some things that I would call what I would call, so there's something you should embrace, something that I think you should resist. One of the things I think people should learn to resist is the lure of easy commerce, right? When you
Hmm.
say I can buy anything now and it can come in, I think we're making bad choices because what's happening is that we're not realizing the implications of some of those actions, not from an AI data perspective, but as consumers with some level of sustainability that's there, right? You look at the amount of packaging that comes with every time when you order one little thing. It's fantastic to get one little thing, but if you get 100 little things a month, that's a lot of packaging. That's a lot of carbon that's being based getting that stuff to you. So in some ways, I think we need to resist some of the lure of the algos, right? And some I think we should completely reject because it's a black hole into which we're getting sucked in and we don't know sometimes. There's been some fantastic articles done about right wing and YouTube, these things and how fanaticism, is all being done and so on. And social is one of those things, right? It can just suck you into that. Now, these are my preferences of what you embrace, resist, and reject. You as an individual need to make your choices of what you embrace, what you resist, and what you reject. But I think that's a useful way in which I say as an individual you look at it, right? I would say you got to be very, very conscious of your privacy. Accept that your privacy is gone, that everybody can track you, but still be as conscious as you can. The other thing I tell people as an individual, Roshan, is embrace brands that compute at the edge,
Hmm.
not on the cloud. By which I mean, if somebody is doing something on your phone, if the device is computing on the phone and not sending it to the cloud, that's a better choice to make
Hmm.
because then it's not sitting in some mega brain somewhere, if you will. But overall, net good because I think our brain is cognitively overloaded. We can't handle this much information. We need something to simplify it and give us something that's relevant for us. We just have to exercise enough care that that thing is not becoming our master and that we're not becoming its slave.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with everything that you just said. I think it's probably the best and the scariest time to be a consumer, right? Because if you look at anything, right? I mean, whether it's take brokerage fees, I mean, it's down to zero. Then you have endless hours of content on Netflix or YouTube or whatever. You have huge discounts on clothes, electronics, whatever. You have food delivered at the tap of a button, right? I mean, this is a fantastic time for you to be a consumer. but it's also, I think, the fastest time in history perhaps you could end up really broke and really unwell and really, like, mentally off balance, I would say, right? So I think it imputes a
Not only those
huge.
three things, which are interesting, you mentioned, Roshan, but I would say one thing: we are raping the world with our
Yeah,
consumerism,
yeah,
right? I mean, just look at what you're going to leave our kids. As, if you keep going in this thing of I can just do it because I can do it because somebody removed the friction. The problem is we've removed all friction, which
yeah,
is great. From, as you said, it's a great time for me as a consumer. We now need to bring back consciousness into our choices.
absolutely, absolutely. So, Suresh, I want to delve on another aspect of your career itself, which is selling to building and selling for large enterprises, right? There's a huge interest among people, especially in, among SaaS folks and whatever, to build something for, large enterprises like banks or airlines or whatever, where, you can sell probably six-figure check sizes, right? I mean, you have large deals and so on. Now, it's sounds very good, but I'm sure, it's not as straightforward as it sounds, right? I mean, what are some of the nuances that people have to be aware of when they think about building and selling to the enterprise?
So that's a great question. I'm going to start by saying the grass is always greener on the other side. My Everybody asks me, why don't you go and sell to medium and small enterprises and have thousands of clients? So and the people who are sitting on that side saying, why can't I go and sell to a large enterprise and get a 6-figure, 7-figure check like we are able to, right? And I think there's nothing right or wrong about either choice. It's about making the choice and understanding, as you said, the implications of that choice, and then saying, how do I deal with it? Now, we made the choice to go to large enterprises. It's something that, one, I'm inherently comfortable with. But the moment you go on that, you want that 6-figure, 7-figure check, there are certain things that you have to accept. First, it's a complex journey for a large enterprise. It's a multi stakeholder sale. You need to give them a solution. You can't give them a product. You can't say this works. Not even the best SaaS companies in the planet, the Adobes and the Salesforce can just say it just works. They need to kind of craft it into a solution that works for that client. They need to deal with multiple stakeholders, and they need to know it's a complex buying journey. And if you're not prepared to embrace that, Roshan, don't go there. If you want to say download, install, buy, pay, stay with SME because it's a great market. There's no judgment about that, right? The second thing is that you have to accept is that it takes time. 6 to 9 months is a good sales cycle. I would say it can be longer, right? And therefore you have to focus on something, right? What are two key ratios that I tell people to focus on? My own thing is CAC to LTV and NRR. I mean, all SaaS companies measure cost of customer acquisition, but when you measure the cost of customer acquisition to LTV, then you suddenly land up with a different metric. And I'll explain what it means, right? You can't hope to go to a large enterprise and say, I'm going to go through this complex buying cycle, 6 to 9 months, multi-stakeholder sale, and sell them a $60,000 product. Your cost of acquisition is going to be immense. And this is where you start to burn money as a company. You have to accept that if your cost of acquisition is high, it works both ways, right? If you want a long-term value, a lifetime value that's in the like 7 figures, hopefully over 3 or 4 years, you have to accept that there's a higher cost of acquisition. And if you have a high cost of acquisition, you have to say, boss, I don't want a small contract value because it doesn't make sense. And the second one is that revenue retention, which is, do I get renewals, right? For the same reason that large companies take a long time to make a decision, they don't let go of things very easily because they made a decision. They've gone through a process. They will try to make it work. And funnily enough, one banking CEO told me, you know what, the problem is if you sell me something that's a $10,000 a month, it doesn't even come to me. I will only review projects that are $1 million a month. If I review the project, then I know I will ask questions, and the guy who's coming and selling, pitching to me, and coming to that review will prepare for it, and he has to show it's a success. So he'll work to make it a success. For $100,000, nobody will bother, and they won't renew. So there's some complexities in that whole. I think it takes time. The third thing I would say is embrace services. Bad word in SaaS.
Yeah, very
You don't
bad
need
word.
to do it all yourself. You don't need to do it all yourself. Find partners. But unless you go in and embed yourself deep inside the enterprise and accept that they will want some level of service. I mean, Adobe has services team. Salesforce does services with partners, right? They're basically externalizing the problem to somebody else. But there is no such thing as a pure SaaS product for us, Salesforce. Somebody needs to implement it. Question is whether it's Salesforce or somebody else. So I think you need to embrace the fact that it's services either done by you or done by somebody else, right? And I made this point earlier, right? Legacy environments are hard. You have to deal with them, right? You can't do something in a large enterprise and say, no, chuck everything and do it my way. They won't. And that also means the last one, which I talked about earlier, people are not paid to be cutting edge in a large enterprise. They are meant to avoid risk. Their decision making is, I don't want to be wrong. You said, cannot be wrong rather than be right. So these are the 5 learnings I have from this, from selling to large enterprises. It can be worthwhile. It is painful, but it's just a different kind of pain. I mean, it's painful to go and sell to 1,000 SMEs and sign them up as
Yeah.
well, right? It's just a different kind of pain.
Yeah, and deal with, I don't know what it is, 15-20% churn every year, right? Or perhaps more. I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So it is what kind of pain that you want to proactively sort of embrace. So
Yep. Absolutely.
I'm going to stick around with the large enterprise question for just a bit, right? So you mentioned, all of these amazing things, right? And I think if someone is listening to this podcast, they'd like to have a hack to break into the enterprise. So let's say, I mean, I will commit to building, post sales, customer success, services. I will commit to, investing in a long enough sales cycle, right? And I will commit to sort of working with the stakeholders, aligning their priorities, figuring out what the buying committee is like, process is like, etc., investing all of that, right? Is there a hack to sort of break into the large enterprise? If I'm selling to the first customer that I'm going to, right? How do I escape this, who have you deployed before question? Right? I mean, is that through, I mean, some kind of a pilot or POC, or, what is the route that is most amenable to kind of break into? Again, I'm sorry, it's a very
I
unfair
wish there was a
question.
no, no.
It's
I
a
wish
it's
there
a
was an
billion
easy
dollar
answer.
question.
If there was, I'd be worth like $1 billion or 10 or maybe 100, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but
What are
let me
what
try
are
and
some things that have
let me
worked
try
for
and
you?
break up
Yeah,
the hack.
yeah,
Let me not give it to you as one hack. Let me try and break up the hack, right?
yeah, yeah.
I think the first thing is that you've got to be clear that there is one or two small specific solutions or use cases
Mm,
that you really want to focus on. You can't go in there with a broad spectrum case in a large enterprise,
mm,
because then you're really talking about a platform that's massive. You say, I'll do this one thing or one or two things really, really well, right? So I think that's one thing that you must know. Don't go in there and saying, I'm going to go from selling this first thing to the largest enterprises in the world, but I'm going to sell a big horizontal.
mm,
Go vertical,
mm,
right? Try and solve one problem really, really well, right? And there are people who do that, who have taken that approach, that, right? The second one is hire somebody for whom language like Medic and Bant and all these, sales cycle and understanding those processes is bread and butter.
yeah.
Either hire them or get a consultant to do it, because those processes really work, right? I mean, if you take Medic, what metrics, what's the economic buyer, who's the champion, what's the decision criteria, what's the decision process. All of these processes work for a reason.
Mm,
They've been crafted by salespeople over 30 or 40 years. That's the hack. Their hack is the sales process works. And the sales process needs to be turned up and applied rigorously every single day. Just like when you say, I'll sign 100 customers, I know that some of them will churn, but I know I got to get to the 100 customers, I know some will churn.
mm,
So I would say basically a sales process is the big hack, right, that you need to do. The third one is you have to be prepared to, I won't actually, more than actually, maybe the third one I would say is find a champion in one or two clients who has the power to make an economic decision. Don't just go in there with hope and say, I've got a great product, I'm going to go to 10 guys or whatever it is, right? You need to find that, to your question, how do you get that first one? In some enterprise somewhere, maybe two or three, you got to find an economic buyer or a champion who wants you and who's willing to take that chance. By the way, general in Asia, less of those people. General in the US, hell of a lot of those people.
yeah.
In the US, I'm fond of saying this, Roshan, no one asks you, if you go in Asia, Middle East, in our home markets, a lot of people will say, no, which town are you from? What's your horoscope? When were you born? They want to know all this. If you go to the US, the guy says, what do you have to sell?
Yeah.
Hey, that's good. Can I try it? Okay, I'll try it. I'll trust you, right? I'll give you one chance. So I think one of the things you want to do is to find that economic buyer or champion in a large enterprise, and you need to find one. If you try to find 10, you have a problem, right? Find one to get that one or two breakthrough points to say, I now have a use case. And there are people like that in the world, and there are many people like that. In my first startup, Roshan, I was very fond of saying, right, the kindness of strangers is what kept me going. Many people said, there are people who say, I really want to try and make this work, and I want to try and make it work with you. You got to find those people, right? And I
Mm,
think,
mm,
and obviously you have to be doing stuff like, you have to be able to do the pilot, and you have to be able to invest a considerable amount of your time
mm.
as a founding team. May not be the founder, but some senior founding team members. You have to go in there and literally treat it as a startup within a startup to make that work. So those would be the, I'm not saying they're hacks, but they were the simplest ways you can get in to do something.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a superb set list, I would say, right? I mean, for people looking at the enterprise. Suresh, I know we've exceeded time, but I have to ask you this one last question, right? Which is, anytime I have a serial entrepreneur on the podcast, I ask them, what are they doing differently right now, yeah, compared to their first journey or second journey. And often, they have a whole laundry list of things that they've figured they want to do slightly differently, or perhaps they're wiser from experience, right? So I want to leave you with that question. What is it that you're doing differently? How are you executing differently on this journey compared to what you did 10 years back?
That's a great question. And okay, there are no easy answers to this one either. You're asking me a lot of. Let me try and explain what happened when I set out to do this, and I'll tell you what's happened in the 8 years that I've been doing this one. I said to myself one thing. I said, try not to make the same mistake that you did. You're going to make mistakes. I said, don't make the same mistakes. And let me tell you what happened in the 8 years. I overcompensated. I made new ones. Some of the new ones were new, and because you're trying to go into different areas and all that stuff, and they were new. But the mistakes I made was also for overcompensating. One of the problems we had, for example, just to share something, is that when we sold our company the last time, we figured out that our compliance levels in our previous company, the legalities, all the contracting wasn't very good,
Mm,
and we lost a lot of money in the final deal because of that.
mm,
So I said we got to make sure it's all okay, and I over engineered compliance and legality and all of that in the early stages of this company, and probably spent time and effort doing something that wasn't needed at the early stage. And you need to do it when you get to a certain stage, right?
mm,
We went senior very early in terms of the management build out in this startup, probably too early. Whereas in the earlier one, we built it out with young people and we got in senior people only literally towards the end, right? And I said, no, that maybe that was a mistake. Maybe that's why I didn't scale fast enough.
mm,
So we went senior too early. The first one was bootstrap. This one we raised a lot of money early, and that also leads to other problems, right? When you have money, you say, okay, can. And like with all startups, and I think if there's any startup entrepreneur who thinks that just because they've raised money, it's all going to keep the party is going to keep going on, I'm going to disillusion you. It won't. You'll come to your downturn,
mm,
and until you hit that, you don't build a great startup.
mm,
So we raised money too early, and then we went through a downturn. And I think the last 2 3 years we've kind of grown again back spectacularly. So for me, if you look at it, these things were all things I didn't do in my first startup. I thought I'm not going to make those mistakes, and I overcompensated in this. I did make a couple of things that I did really well in my first startup. I didn't do in my second, and I'm hating myself for those.
mm,
And I'm hating myself for those because those were things I should not have made. I knew they worked. I just didn't replicate that success. One of those, for example, is that we didn't spend enough time and money in this startup in the early years. And we talked about our values. We kind of put that in. We said we want to do the training, but we didn't spend enough time and money on embedding it into the culture. And now we are compensating for that. And that's one of the things that we did really well in the previous startup, training and culture. So if I look at it on the net, I've now learned four new mistakes that I don't want to make. If I ever go to my third startup, my wife will kill me. But I don't know whether I'll overcompensate, or maybe this time I'll say I'm going to be in the middle of these two things when I do my next one.
So this has been a fascinating conversation, Suresh. There's plenty more that we can talk about, and I'd love to maybe do a follow-up conversation sometime. But for now, I mean, I'll leave you to it. Thank you so much, for sharing your experiences and your insights. It was super entertaining, super insightful. So thanks so much, Suresh.
Thank you very much, Roshan, for having me. I hope it was as interesting, and I found the questions very fascinating. I hope my journey helps somebody kind of learn a few lessons and not make the same mistakes I did.
Maybe they'll make new ones.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.